Okay, hi guys, I'm Cassidy. I did my documentaries on the Northern Pacific Railroad. This first documentary is about just kind of how they came about and why we needed a railroad system, and then actual laying down of the train tracks itself. So we're going to start back in 1863. The Civil War was still happening, and there were two major rail lines being built, the Sacramento and the Central Pacific. Both of these were kind of in a lull though, because there wasn't really any government funding. And there weren't any workers, because a lot of the people who could have been working were in the Civil War fighting instead. So, in 1864, the Civil War ended and Congress created the Railroad Creation Act, which would give government funding to the railroad companies in order to build new rail lines, because we knew how important it was going to be able to transport goods faster from the East Coast to the West Coast. And at that time, a railroad was the most practical way to do that. So, that was when the Railroad Creation Act was signed by Abraham Lincoln in the summer of 1864. That was when the Northern Pacific Railroad Company railroad system started. Yeah. So construction began in 1870. So in those 6 years where construction hadn't started yet, there were land surveyors and survey parties going through and deciding where the train tracks would actually be laid down, and also what needed to be taken down in order to build them. They didn't actually start cutting down trees or anything like that. They just went through and laid out where it was going to be, mapped it out, and wrote out instructions. Then the next people who came in were the graders, and they would prepare sections of 100 miles at a time. It would take them about 30 days, about a month, to do that on the plains. One difficult thing about this railroad system is that Montana and Washington were still territories at this time, so a lot of the land wasn't ready in any way, shape, or form for a railroad system to be built on top of it. So when the graders did come by, especially in the more northwestern states, it took them a lot longer than that 30 days to prepare the 100 miles. So the railroad took a lot longer than others would have to be built. So the train track line route, they decided to roughly followed the Lewis and Clark expedition. It was pretty loosely, but it kind of followed the Lewis and Clark expedition. They decided to start it at 2 points. The first point they would start out would be Lake Superior, and the second would be Puget Sound, and they would start building from each end and kind of meet in the middle when they would be finished. So the rough terrain made it really hard for them to be building, but also the weather made it hard to build. Obviously, you know the weather here. It's kind of hard to be out there doing like a lot of manual labor, especially during the winter when it's so cold and the ground is so much harder. And then the last thing that made it really, really difficult for them to build a railroad system was that there was no existing railroad system already from the East Coast to the West Coast. So there was no way for them to transport the materials from the East Coast to the West Coast without like walking them through the Great Plains. That wasn't very practical, and it just wasn't really even a possibility to make sense at all. So if they needed to transport materials, which they definitely did, they had to go around by water, which took a lot longer which took a long time, but it was a lot shorter, and it was definitely less expensive, less dangerous. So after the ground had been prepared, the next thing that would happen would be the track layers would come through, and they would put down the railroad tracks themselves. So this is the most exciting part, especially for the people who were in settlement along the rail line, because this is when the train could actually come through, and this would be their fastest and most efficient connection back to the East Coast, which they hadn't really had before. It wasn't really an option for them to like go back and buy things from the East Coast. It just didn't really make sense. So this was definitely really exciting for them. So exciting in fact that they would have parties when the railroad tracks would be finished around them. And then in 1883, the Northern Pacific Railroad was the first to be completed, including out of the Sacramento and the Central Pacific, which had been two that had been started before it. So in 1883 it was finished, and they had a big party to celebrate. Everyone around was really excited because they knew how important this was going to be, and they knew how helpful it was going to be. Yeah, that's the background information.